welcome back. We're going to pick up right where we left off with this nice snowman and his light, where we had like the dust showing these beams and some fairies flying around this little snowbank. And at this point we're basically done with building things inside of Blender, and what we want to do is take a closer look at the rendering and how we get an output that we want, and what we can do post-rendering, which broadly falls under this idea of compositing in Blender, in order to make the image a little bit better or maybe a little bit more appealing in the end, like after we spent the time rendering. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And so let's just go ahead and get started. The default is to render this at a resolution of 1080p, or for like a 1080p television. And that's still a pretty common standard for people to use, but 4K is getting more and more popular. And so what happens if you wanted to render this image not at 1080p, but at 4K? Well, we need to change the resolution. And to change the resolution, make sure we have the camera selected, because it's going to be easier to see what's going on. If we click on this output, so this is render, this is camera, and this here with like the printer coming out, that's output properties. And when we click on there, we can see the resolution that it gives us, 1920 by 1080, and that's what 1080p resolution is. And so what's happening is along the Y there's actually 1080 pixels, and along the X there's 1920 pixels. So if we want to increase this to like 4K, 4K is 3840, so that's going to be along here 3840 by 2160. And as soon as I click this, you can kind of see what happened is that it's like resizing this box a little bit to accommodate that, and then 2160. So this is how we change the resolution. Now I have something that's in 4K. If I go ahead and render, it's going to take a little longer because there's a lot more pixels, like a lot more pixels. So we'll actually go back and do 1080p after this, but just to give you a sense, now it's big, it's high resolution, and you know, like it's like so big that it's hard for you to see. It's actually off the screen size, and I could zoom in and out, and so there's out, and yeah. But again, that took a long time, so we don't need that. So let's go back to 1080p, and so it's going to be 1920 by 1080. And now there's a lot fewer pixels. We've already seen how long it takes to render this, and I think like this is an acceptable amount of time. Another thing that we might do instead of changing the resolution is also thinking about this idea of depth of field, right? And so normally when we take a picture, or even with your eyes, if you think about your eyes, because the camera's kind of doing the same thing as your eyes, is like we have a particular object that's in focus. And so if I hold my hand out and I look at my hand, my fingers might be in focus, but what's behind it and what's in front of it isn't really in focus. And so we have this focal plane, and we have it with our eyes, we have it with cameras. So how do we, like when we see something that's totally sharp like this, especially at low light, it looks a little funny to us because we're used to this. And so how do we change that? Well, we can go into the properties of the camera. So if we have the camera selected and click on the camera, then I have depth of field effects. So I want to check that, and now I can change the depth of field. And what's happening right now is it's setting the focus distance at 10 meters, and then it's also giving it an f-stop of 2.8. And the f-stop is, if you're not like familiar with this, it's like how wide open the iris is on the camera. Think about it as like how dilated your eye is. If it's really big, then you have a really like sharp plane of focus. And if your eye is like dialed down really tight, you have like a lot of things in focus. And so the f-stop has like the opposite, is like inversely related. So small f-stops means like wide dilated, and you'll have a like less of a depth of field. But let's see what this looks at right now. It's at 2.8 and a focus distance of 10, and let's just render that and see what happens. Takes a little longer, but that's okay. You can see like maybe it's a little less sharp than it used to be, and that was at an f-stop of 2.8. I said like smaller f-stops mean like a wider opened iris, and so we're gonna get a narrower depth of field. So now everything's blurry, and you think like, well, that's weird. Like this kind of looks like something that's in the background, right? Like that nice blurry image. And that's because we're focusing on something that's 10 meters away. And the thing we want to look at, which isn't maybe this light post, but probably we want this snowman to be in focus. And there's a couple different ways that you can set this, but what we're going to do is we're going to just say focus on object. So I'm going to click on this, and then we're going to pick an object. How about, a lot of times when we look at people, the thing that's of most interest to us is like the eyes. So let's focus this on one of the eyes. So object icosphere, that's one of the eyes. So I'll click on that. Now we're focusing on that. All right, we could have also typed this in, and so maybe I should have named one of the icosphere eyes, so it'd be easier, but hindsight. And so now the focal plane is going to be sharp right on the eyeball, and things in front and behind it might be blurry, although not too much, right? And so if we wanted to make the background objects look even blurry now compared to that, we just got to keep lowering this f-stop. So how about 0.1, and then you can see like what that might do. But that doesn't look too bad, and that's how you can give this like illusion that you're looking through a camera, and the camera is adding this like what's in focus, what's not, things that are in the plane are, things that are behind aren't, and it helps us a little bit with like depth cues. All right, now we're sort of done with the render project. I want to think about what's next, which is like we've rendered. Let's see what we can do like after the render. And the way we do that is we go into compositing. And so now we're introducing a new element, which is up here. We've been in layout. We've lived in this tab the whole time. We did spend a little bit of time in geometry nodes, but we sort of disguised it. But we could have also gone to like the geometry node section that way if we wanted. But what we want actually is compositing. All right. This down here, which just became big, let me go back to layout real quick. This down here is like a timeline. All right, but we're not making an animation, so it's not really important. So when I go to compositing, I don't really need to see all this, and we can try to see if I can make it small. Okay, it goes away. So compositing is all gonna happen in here, and you don't see anything, and it's like sort of confusing. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna use more nodes, and we have to tell it that. So we're gonna click here to say use nodes. And look at what happens, like there's two things. One says composite it, and one says render layers. And so this is the output of what we rendered, and all it's saying is like this should go to like this composite node just sends it back to the render layer, so that our like render output looks like whatever the final product of everything we're going to do is. So we need both of these because we want this to appear in our rendered window eventually when we get back to that. But we're going to edit this a little bit first, and we're working with nodes, and so we can just do all the same like node stuff that we're used to. Okay, and I think like, okay, so what's something we could do? How about we think about like what this looks like in terms of brightness and darkness. Let's see if we can adjust bright and dark levels. So just like in our other node section, and just like everywhere else in Blender, Shift A lets us add a node. And we're gonna adjust things like the color, okay, and we're actually gonna go to RGB curves, but I wanna show you something else here, add something new, which is that we can always just search for what we're looking for. So here's RGB, and then we can see there comes up curves. And so I didn't have to go through these menus. Just like in the other nodes, I make this like highlighted and I click it in, and then I can do stuff like play around with this, all right? And it's like weird, I can't quite, like what's going on if I wanted to see like what this node does basically is like the stuff on the right adjusts the light levels, the stuff on the left adjusts the dark levels. So like, well, let's see what I mean by that. I hit this, and then I go render, F12, and now maybe you could tell it looks a little darker. I don't know, but it's like kind of hard to tell what's going on. And so maybe we want to see it like dynamically change, but I had to remember what it was before, and I hit render, and that's confusing. So let's move this back to where it was and think about something we could do to make our lives easier. And the way to do that is a new node where I say add, search, since we know that functionality now, and say view. And so we can say viewer, and now I have this view node. The screen just turned black because you'll see in just a moment that what I could do is drag the output of this to the viewer, and now I get an image of the output into the viewer. So the viewer shows me the output of whatever node I'm connected to. And that's pretty convenient. It's kind of weird to have it in the backdrop, which I think is like a little confusing to see all this. So let's actually make our lives a little easier yet again. We'll drag this a new window over. Remember, we can do that by just clicking at one of these rounded corners. I drag this out, and then this layer, I don't want it to be the editor. I would like it to be an image editor. So I want to see an image. And then I can point at what image I want, and I want the viewer node output. And now this is the same image as what's back in here. Maybe that also seems a little confusing, but that's okay. We can actually make it a little less confusing by turning off this backdrop image. And that's done right here. So let's just click off backdrop, and now I just have these nodes, and that's maybe a little easier to see. Okay, so this goes to the viewer outputs to here. It also goes to the composite, which means it's going to show up in our final rendered image. So what does this do? We got this RGB curves, and I said it sort of adjusts the light and dark values. So now we have a dynamic thing that shows us what's going on. So let's take this now and drag it down and see. If I drag this down and release it, the whole thing gets a little darker, right? If I drag it up, it becomes light. Here, if I click down here and I had to click once to add a little point, then I can adjust this point. And when I drag it up like this, what's going to happen is that I make the dark parts lighter. Okay, too light, obviously. You can do other things. You know, you can, like now it's a little bit lightened. Now it's more like what we had, which I think looks better. I can even go over here and like make it too dark. So what do? Well, other things, we can introduce new points just by clicking here, and now look, it'll like curve. So what if I do something like this where I'm getting rid of a lot of the light points and keeping some of the dark points, and maybe we think that looks good, maybe we think it doesn't really matter, and I can like also drag this down to like make the image look even dimmer. I can have like this hump in there if I want, emphasize like the mid-tones over the other. It kind of like, you know, that doesn't really look great, but yeah. Maybe something like that. I don't know. We're not, you know, I'm just trying to show you what's going on. I actually think like the original rendered image looked pretty good. And one way you could check it, right, is to drag all these back to where they used to be, but that's sort of like also a pain. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just like take this node and like turn it off, like it's not doing anything? And you can. So if I have a node selected and I press M, it grays out, and that means this node no longer is having an effect. I have this red line, and it's like it's just going through without being affected at all. If I press M, I get it back. And so this is an easy way to like cycle between on and off and see which I like better. You know, maybe the adjusted one is slightly better. Okay, now what else could we do? I mean, there's light and dark, but there's also actual colors. And so let's see if we can adjust the colors in a way. So we can search, and then what we're going to search for here is hue correct. And there it is. I get a node. Look, it's like real beautiful. I'm going to put it right here. And then I can go in and look what it gives me in terms of values. HSV, we know what that is. Hue, saturation, value, right? Hue is like the correction to the color. Saturation is how much of that color is present. And value is basically how much light or black is involved. Okay, so how do we think about that working? Well, I can get like, here's some blue. That's pretty easy to see. So let's think about what happens. If I'm in hue, maybe I could like drag this up, and then you think like, great, you did something, but nothing happened. Well, the reason is that this image is linked to the RGB curves, and we want to see the output from the hue correct. So one thing we could do is like drag from here and put it in there, but then you're like clicking and dragging all the time. So there's a hotkey that's worth knowing, which is hold down Control and Shift, and then left click. And that automatically moves the node that you clicked on to be in the viewer. All right, good. So now I've hue corrected this. You can see like I moved this up, and we're getting like something that's a little, like the blues are turning kind of purple, or I can move it down, and now they're like maybe a little bit more greenish. And we're like basically like turning up and down. Like it's a little hard to think about this in terms of the rainbow it's given us, but clearly I'm changing the color of this blue, which is here. This kind of looks almost like green, I don't know, so let's like drag this up a little bit and see if we can get it to look just a little bit more reddish yellow, I don't know. A little hard to control here, but that's okay, we have saturation. Now if I click on that, I can separately control the saturation, and let's just like crank this up, crank that down. You can see like it's mixing that in and out just a little bit. So maybe I really want this like yellow light to have a lot of saturation, not making a big difference. And then value, this is like how light and dark it is, so I can crank this blue all the way down, and I lose a little bit of the brightness. I can crank it all the way up. Subtle. It can be subtle, and in this case it is, but that's okay. So we've done like a mild correction here, and maybe if we had like more vibrant colors, it would be a little easier to see what's going on. But this is a good node to be aware of. Okay, what else should we do? I mean, we kind of have like the adjust the brightness, adjust the darkness, adjust the colors. That's sort of like putting the fine details on like those visual elements. But there's a few other things that we could do to maybe help this image along a little bit. And one of the things that I think is interesting is if I look at this, like there's dark here and there's dark here, but it's kind of light right here and it's kind of light right here. And if we were taking a camera image of something, which is again, like a lot of times it's not always what we're trying to simulate, but a lot of times that is what we're trying to simulate, then the very edges of our picture are actually a little darker than the middle. And the reason that that happens is again because we're like pulling in light from the side of a lens and we bring it in, and so we gather a little less light from the oblique angles into the lens. And because we gather less light, we get less of that photochemical reaction, or we impinge on our CCD less, and so it looks a little darker. So how do we do that? Well, what we kind of want to do is take like a dark mask and put it over the top, and then like just sort of like make that mask look like this subtle darkening on the edges. And so that would look like maybe a circle or an ellipse, depending on exactly like how we've taken this picture. And if I look here, what I can do is we want a mask, so I'll say mask, and then there's also an ellipse mask, and that's what we want. And I want it actually up here all by itself, because what we want to do is take like this color corrected image and then put a mask on top of it. That's what we're going to try to do next. And so what we need to do is take this image of a mask, which if I control shift left click, I can see there it is. That's the mask I have. And that would be sort of silly because it's like too tight. But if I look at the mask here, right, then I can click and drag and make it a little bit wider, a little bit taller, so it looks a little bit more like comes to the edges of the frame, let's say. All right, and then what I'd like to do, we'll sort of fix this in a little bit. It's kind of sharp, and we'll fix that, but I want to get to the part where we overlay this, because I want that to be on top of this image. And the way we do that is we use something called a mix node. And so Shift A, search, mix, there it is. And what we want to do is mix this image with this mask. And the way that Blender works is that when we order these nodes, the bottom node is the thing on top. And I guess it's a little bit like, you know, we said in views, the thing that's like first in the list is on top, and in Matplotlib, it's like the thing on the bottom is on top. And so the way to remember this is like just reading down is telling you the order that it's layering things up. And so we want the mask to be on top of the image. So I'll take this mask and I'll put it here. And then I'll take this image and put it here. And so now what we've done is we've put the image in, and then we've put a mask on top of it. And if I wanted to see what that looked like, I can of course go Control Shift L, and now I have this mask that's on top of the image, which is why I can't see it. Okay, so maybe we want this thing where we could actually see the image. What's going on is that like mix isn't really what we want. We want multiply. And the way that like multiply works in Blender is it treats black as 0 and white as 1. And so I'm going to take like the image that's underneath when I hit multiply. I'm going to take this image, and here I'm going to multiply that image by 1, meaning it's going to be there. Here I'm going to multiply it by 0, which means it's not going to be there. All right. Multiply. So now I have a cutout image, which again isn't quite what we want, right? Because in a camera, that's not how it works. It's not like there's, like you get to the edge of this like lens and then like nothing comes through once you get to like a certain angle or something like that. So how do we handle that? Well, if I think about what this mask looks like, I'm going to Control Left Shift on that mask. It would be nice if this was like somehow faded from 1 to 0, but did it smoothly. And way that we could think about that visually is that this gets blurry, right? So it starts white, goes through some grays, darker and darker and darker grays until it gets to the black. And so what we want to do is take this mask and make it blurry. So let's look for a node that would do that. How about blur? That seems all right. So we add in the blur node, and we can't, it doesn't look like it did anything, and that's for two reasons. One is that we're still looking at the mask, so let's just control left shift on blur. Still nothing's happened, and that's basically because it has no size. So we want to specify how this blurs along the X and the Y. So let's go ahead and, I don't know, let's pick something like 100. I mean, I would think of this in terms of pixels maybe is the right way to think about it. So look, I just blurred along X, and then I just blurred along Y by putting in 100 here. So it's getting a little bit blurrier. This size here also can affect this, right? So we're this also scales the size that we give in the X and the Y. So let's just leave the size at 1. And if I want to see how this affects what we saw on the overview, Control Shift on this multiply tab, and then we can see now I have this gradated color. It's still too sharp, so let's make this a lot bigger. How about 300 and then 300? And you can see the computer actually has to work a little bit to do it. So now it's kind of getting there. Maybe we could even do more. 600. Let's not 60. Double it yet again and see how we like that. Okay, now we're getting kind of the effect I wanted, which is it's clearly dark up in the corners, but it fades off, and even down here we're getting that subtle sort of masking effect. This appearance where we've now isolated the middle part of this in a way visually draws our eye in is also called a vignette or vignetting. That's a nice way to keep our eye focused in on here. Two things I want to say. One is even though we've done this, we would never see it because we still haven't drawn this multiply tab and put it on the output. So we have to make sure that we're always taking the last thing we want and putting it on the output for the compositor. Okay, the other thing is it's remember that we can click on things and then hit M. So this is what it looked like without the blur. This is ridiculous. Here's what it looks like with that blur. It's kind of pleasing. Last thing. Since we're thinking about camera lenses and the fact that the camera's gonna make this light circle that we can see surrounded by dark edges, that's not the only thing that lenses do in distorting our image. Because we when we know this, if you shine light through a piece of glass or a prism or something, it'll separate out into colors, and also it'll slightly distort the image and make it look curved a little bit or something like that. And these are called lens distortions, I guess. And we can add those in with a node called lens distortions. The question is where to put it. And so you think about this workflow. I could put it at the end, but then we've done sort of all this hard work of blurring things and correcting the color, and now I'm gonna distort that. And so maybe it'd be better to put it earlier on. And then we can see what that distorted image looks like, and then we can correct it. So I'm going to put it here in the beginning. I mean, there's, you can kind of put it wherever you want, but I think it's going to be easier or give us a better result to have, the lens distortion at the beginning. So I'll click here and it'll put it in for us. And then right now, we can see it because we have this gone to the output, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. And every time we want to make a change here, it's going to have to calculate all that. So let's just Control Shift. And now we've gotten rid of everything we've done, and all we're seeing is this lens distortion. So the two, I mean, you can play around with everything, but let's just focus on these two. So what's distort do? If I click and drag on this, you can see the distortion is making this curved, and it goes from 0 to 1. And so maybe we don't want it that distorted. Maybe we don't even want it that distorted. Maybe we just want this real subtle bending. And remember, I can click and have M, and so you can see what's happening is it's just ever so slightly popping the image up and giving it that distortion. And maybe that's what you want, maybe not. Obviously, if you then do this, you need to crop the edges before you send it. And so if this was supposed to be 1080p, you'd want to make it slightly bigger so you could crop out the little black bars that are appearing here. We'll keep that. The other thing that can happen is what's called dispersion. And so I middle click to pan, just like we're in the nodes. Let's look at this real quick and let's crank this dispersion. See if we can like see it somewhere else a little bit better maybe. I'll turn this node back on. There's a good example right here. There's a good example right there. There's one at the edges. And again, remember, like, because we're handling like the lights coming in from the side, oblique angles, and we're going to get bigger curvature, and so bigger separation out into those rainbows. And so maybe we don't want that of 1, but maybe we want it of like 0.1. And then you look at this and you think like, that's probably still too much, right? Like that looks kind of ridiculous. That looks kind of ridiculous. Almost like super sci-fi. So let's go down to 0.01. And now you're just starting to see like the sharpness of these colors out at the edges separate. I'll turn this off so we can see that. Right? Just a little bit of blurring at the edges. And it's subtle, but it is something that we're used to seeing in photos. And so this is something that'll help our image look a little bit more like it was captured by a photo. Maybe we could say like, I want it to be like a bad photo. Oh, 2. No, 0.02. All right. Like we have a bad camera, and now we're starting to get some like more severe effects. Okay, so at this point, we're done. We can see the final effect if we want by clicking on this mix. This is our mix node. And we can left click like this. And this is everything together. So we have distorted it, then we've color adjusted it, then we've put a mask on top of it to vignette it. And this is what it actually looks like when all said and done. What happens when you render is it drops the new rendered image into here. Then it sends it through the compositing, which depending on what you're doing, could take a really long time. And then when it's done, we said it drops it back. This node here drops it back into the render window. So let's see that. I render it. We're going to see it pop up without compositing. Now it changed to compositing. And then we're done. And then if you want to save it, it works like anything else. Control S, and that saves like an instance of it that's hidden somewhere on your computer that you could try to find. Or you can say save as and then put it somewhere. So this is in like the like tutorial thing for this. And so I'll say this is our final snowman. Okay. And then I can hit return, and then you can close the window and you'll be sad because return doesn't do what you think it does the first time you press it, and then you have to press it again. So return twice in Blender to enter your changes and actually save the thing. And now we really are done. So at this point, we basically have all the tools that we need to do something better with chemical imagery. We understand the objects that we can make. We understand how to scale and rotate those objects, how to manipulate them. We understand how to capture images, how to control lighting, and then how to change those images when we're done. And so next tutorial, we'll move away from snowmen to molecules. We'll look at how do we get coordinates that we can input into Blender in a way that's useful, and then look at the options we have for importing them. And then probably in a second tutorial, we'll take a real like complex example and try to make it look beautiful and render that out. Anyway, hope you had fun making the snowman, and I look forward to seeing what you all make.